Welcome back to Questing Beast, I'm Ben. Today we're taking a look at Tomb Robbers of the Crystal Frontier. This is an introductory adventure for level 1 characters, created by Gus L. and designed for old school essentials, but of course it's going to be quite compatible with any OSR type game. Looking at our back cover right here, it's a phantasmagorical Western fantasy. It's a quote from T.S. Eliot, so good taste in poetry. Sky places roar across the night sky, crater the frontier's desiccated wastes. Plummeting from the near heavens, they fall to crack and shatter among the prickly pear of the plain. The crystalline fragments of Empyrean tomb and castle leach magical esters into the tormented land, perverting life and spreading lithic contagion. Yet, these ruined edifices of vibrant crystal hold golden wealth and sorcerous power that draws hungry, desperate throngs and vainglorious fortune seekers alike to test fate on the crystal frontier. An introductory dungeon crawl adventure for 4 to 6 characters for old school essentials. So this is a really fun read. This is one of the best introductory adventures that I've read in a long time, probably up there in my top 5, up there with things like Winter's Daughter or Tomb of the Serpent Kings. As usual, links are down in the description below where you can pick it up for yourself. Before we get started though, this video is brought to you by all of the awesome patrons over on Patreon, as well as this week's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Forgotten Waters, an RPG-inspired board game of pirate adventure that captures the wild and woolly experience of the best sessions. Fill out a Mad Lib-style character sheet, make skill checks with a D12 system, and level up by burying treasure and using skills. I got to play this game myself with some friends, and I have to say one of the best parts was the app that did full-on sound effects and voiceovers for NPCs and story events. You can also play it easily over Zoom without the other players needing their own copy of the game. Check it out using the link in the description below. All right, let's see what we get inside. This is a print-on-demand book from DriveThruRPG, so it is glue-bound. But I like that it is a large format because these large pages allow you to have a lot more information per page than you would in a smaller digest book. It's just my preferred format. It is fairly long. It's about 60 pages, although the main adventure itself goes only up to about page 33 or so. And then the second half of the book is a bunch of appendices, as well as a bonus location that you can have an adventure in. It starts off with the Scholar, an NPC, Adipose Mab, who's the leader of an expedition to go investigate this dungeon. Now, there's bits and pieces of the setting sprinkled out through the beginning here, but it's really near the end of the book that you get a kind of short gazetteer of what's really going on. But the general gist here is that it is a Western frontier-like location, a desert, that is occasionally pummeled by these giant crystal meteors that fall out of the heavens. And every once in a while, inside these crystal meteors is a whole dungeon. Because the Empyreans, which is this spacefaring race, bury their highly ranked people in these crystal dungeons and then toss them down to the earth as kind of a Viking funeral for them. But that provides people in this location with all sorts of possibilities in terms of getting lots of treasure, magic items, but there's a whole lot of danger involved as well. I really like the setting. I like how it leans into D&D as a Western, and it has a lot of just the right amount of weirdness. It's anchored by this cowboy-like setting that's easy for players to understand, but then it puts all of these science fantasy twists on it that are a lot of fun to uncover. We have some gossip on the mule train as it heads toward its location, and the deal. So here is the contract that you have already signed with Mab at the start of the adventure in terms of how you're going to be helping each other. She's going to get you to the location. She has a specialist who can crack open the crystal in a safe manner because when these crystals are cracked, they often leave this crystal dust in the air that can infect you, but she has a specialist that knows how to deal with that. And she has some terms for you that you have agreed with. You're going to be turning over most of the stuff that you find to her, but in return, she's going to give you more locations that you can explore, and she might even give you a bonus if you are very honest with her. There is another dungeon expedition, the Merkveh group, that has reached the rock ahead of you, but no one has heard from them since. So you're going to have to uncover what happened to them along the way. There's a little essay here, the dungeon crawl playstyle, which is really nice. A lot of old school adventures don't include this sort of thing, where it really gets you up to speed with how these types of adventures are supposed to be run. Next up, we have our maps. We have a isometric map right here where it's all in 3D, and then a flat map over here. Both of these are labeled. There's actually more maps that you can find at the back of the book. Let's see if I can pull these up right here that provide even more information. This one is completely unlabeled. You can use this for players, perhaps uncovering it one bit at a time. And this is another summary map with little keys to each of the rooms to help you find stuff even faster, which is really nice. I love it when there's these summaries because it gives you a nice bird's eye view of the whole adventure and you can get up to speed real quick. One of the frustrating things about these maps, though, is that they are actually a little bit difficult to read at times, especially some of these keyed numbers here are very small, and some of the rooms even have letters inside them, but the letters are so tiny, they're basically unreadable. That is a problem when you're trying to find out where the descriptions are referring to. You have to look really closely to be able to see it. I think some clearer typography would be very helpful. One thing I like is that the dungeon is a nice network of rooms and passages. There's lots of different ways that it can be explored. It even has 2 different entrances that you can go in to approach the whole dungeon from different angles, which is even better. There's plenty of different monsters that you can discover in here, as you can see from this random encounter table. Things like hunting echoes, glass spiders, lith mummies, lith zombies, tomb homunculi, bear owls, and so on. There's also a high-level NPC, some powerful characters, that some of which are undead, some of which are actually still alive, lurking around inside this dungeon that you can make friends with, make enemies of, and turn against one another. There is some very important faction play that is at work beneath the surface here that players can turn to their advantage. Most of the important NPCs also have relationships to one another that can be manipulated by a smart party. Each of the random encounters has an omens and signs number assigned to it as well. So you can, if you rolled on this, then you could give players indications or clues about what might be coming up, and then have the next random encounter be that thing. And we have all the stats of those creatures right here as well. I like how all of this is just on these 3 pages, making things very easy to look up. Now we start getting into the actual room descriptions. I love how there are mini maps for each section. So map areas 1 through 3, we actually get to see 1 through 3 right here and how they're related to each other. I would have liked if this was actually a little bit bigger, just so it'd be easier to see some of the details, but it's really nice to have that there. Saves you some flipping back and forth. Each of the different locations has the number, it also has a name, and it has the lighting of that particular room, which is really nice to have that right at the beginning. For example, Area 2, Mirror of the Past, it is dark and it's a puzzle. It even tells you the kind of room that it is to help the GM figure out what they should be expecting, what they should be preparing for. Now, the writing itself of all the different rooms is quite good. It's a little bit florid. It reminds me a little bit of like Patrick Stewart. It's a little bit purple, so to speak. But it does generally get to the point, and there's a good use of things like bolding to help you focus on the most important stuff. There are some rooms where it require a bit of reading, maybe like, 30 seconds to a minute of reading. So I would read this through carefully ahead of time just to make sure that it's all in your head. But it doesn't really give you a lot of unnecessary information. It is trying to give you what you need to know as quickly as possible. Although I think it could be condensed or maybe broken into bullet points a little bit better to help with that. I don't have too many complaints. There's lots of great references as well. For example, in this room, Mirror of the Past, you can see visions of the past, of what happened here in this dungeon. And it doesn't just tell you what those visions are, it tells you if you see these particular things, it tells you what it's referring to. So you as the game master know that stuff ahead of time, and you're not just trying to guess and figure it out with the players. I love how this whole dungeon is densely packed with encounters, not just with monsters that you fight, but with things to interact with. If Highfell, an adventure I reviewed previously, is a pretty vanilla style dungeon, this is the opposite of that. This is a juicy, dense dungeon where every room has something interesting to do. There's a balance of risk and reward in almost every room. You have treasure, but to get the treasure, you have to spend extra time. There's a trap here, and there's a couple different ways you could circumvent it, but are you going to have the time to do that? Are you willing to take the risks? Are you going to crack open this particular vein of crystal, which could poison your character? But if you do, there's treasure on the inside. All of these things are constant throughout the entire adventure. They don't have to be really complex either. For example, in this room, the singing crystals, if you knock into any of the crystals in the room, it starts creating this, humming vibration thing that can slowly render you unconscious or kill you. The simple solution is just to plug your ears, perhaps with wax, in an Odysseus-style solution. It doesn't have to be complex. It just gives the player something to interact with. It forces them to think. It reminds them that this place is dangerous and you can't just waltz through it. You can encounter what is left of Merkfey, the group of adventurers that came here before you. They've all been turned into zombies or wights, although one of them, Merkfey himself, is still intelligent enough that he can be reasoned with or argued with, and he has a kind of faction all of his own. There's some really dangerous stuff like this encysted beast, which is almost unkillable through natural means, unless you find certain alchemical potions that you can dissolve it with. You don't have to fight everything. You can run, you can negotiate, you can just avoid. Here's a perfect example of risk and reward. We have this section right here, which is a whole bunch of chambers back to back. Each of them has these very heavy bronze doors in between, and you can open them. They're not locked, but they're so heavy they take a whole turn to open and have a loud grinding sound unless you oil them ahead of time. So the further you push through these rooms, the more crazy treasures and magic items you're going to be able to find, but the more risk, the more danger you are incurring upon yourselves as more random encounters can start showing up. There's some really great puzzles here as well, like this Prism Tomb, which is a treasure and a trap, because you have this room where you enter over here, and there's these sarcophagi around the walls, which have, of course, a lot of possible treasure in them. But if you just walk into the room and just waltz across the floor, you're going to be taking a lot of damage from some powerful traps. In this case, beams of searing light that can dissolve you to ash. However, you've been seeing this particular symbol all over the dungeon. It is the kind of sigil, it is the king's mark, and it's a motif everywhere. Once you've seen that enough, and of course the DM should be showing you what this image looks like, you can realize that it actually maps out onto this particular shape on the floor. And those are the safe tiles that you can walk on and which give you access to all of the different sarcophagi. One of which that you can open is the Sleeper, who is not even undead. She simply imprisoned herself in there to try and preserve her life over long periods of time. And if you wake her, she can become a powerful ally or a powerful enemy, depending on how you deal with it. Here's another powerful NPC, the Stylite. He's kind of the arch enemy of the Sleeper. You can find him sitting atop this stylite, this column, poking out of a black lake of water inside this tiny cubular room. There's a lot of just very stark, wonderful imagery here that provokes the imagination. And like the Sleeper, he can become your ally or enemy depending on how you deal with him. Although he is much more evil and he will almost certainly turn on you even if you ally with him. Maybe a smart player will intuit that. Here's a really great situation to deal with. You can enter this room through one of these doors, and you have this kind of ledge around the exterior of the room that allows you to sneak around the edge. The whole middle of the room is just covered in crystals and hundreds of dead bodies that have fallen into this pit and been crystallized by this evil space crystal. And once the players start walking through this room, if they're not quiet enough, all hundreds of these bodies will reanimate as zombies and begin shuffling around. Now, as long as players don't actually fall down into the pit, they're pretty safe from all of these things. But if they do, they're in serious trouble. The problem here is that they want to get to this staircase at the end here. This is another reason why I wish these pictures were a little bit bigger. It's just kind of hard to see what's going on there. But they're going to have to get down here eventually, and they're going to have to deal with hundreds of enemies all at once. You can't fight hundreds of enemies, especially if you're at a level 1 party. So you're going to have to get clever. And there's so many ways that players could. It's going to just totally depend on what that particular group of people decide to do. I love how this adventure just provides you with strange and dangerous situations and then kind of shrugs when it comes to how are you going to deal with it. Oftentimes he gives you suggestions, but really he emphasizes it's up to you. Let the players come up with their own plans, and if they make sense, let them happen. Reward intelligent behavior. Once you get to the top of those stairs, you can go through these rooms here where there is another puzzle. We can see the puzzle kind of blown up right here. There is a black and white version of it near the back of the book that you can photocopy for your players. But in this one, you're trying to kind of draw a line through all of these circles. And if there is a kind of a right angle symbol, that means that the line that you're drawing has to go at right angles through that particular circle. And if it's straight, then it has to go straight through that circle. The idea being that each of these circles could be rotated by the PCs in whatever direction. It reminds me a little bit of the puzzles from The Witness. However, you don't have to solve this puzzle in order to complete the dungeon. There are ways around because this is a Jacquard dungeon. And also there's a whole bunch of alternate solutions that players might come up with, including just chopping their way through the walls around this door, although of course that would be quite loud. And these sorts of design principles are found all throughout the rest of the rooms, each of them dense with things to encounter, enemies to fight, and just situations that require intelligent thought. The players that are smart are going to survive a lot better than players that are tough and just have high stats. After all the room keys are done, we have a section on concluding the adventure where he goes through all the different ways that this could shake out. Well, there's no way to anticipate all of them, but you can look at the different ways that the players might interact with the NPCs and how those factions and those powerful NPCs are going to continue on after the players have interacted with them, if they're still alive. This could end up completely changing the face of the Crystal Frontier itself, as these are often powerful wizards that will attract followers and factions to themselves and set up their own rival empires to the forces that are already present. There's a table over here for crystal poisoning. If you're very rash and you're just smashing crystals left and right without taking the care to crack them at just the right angle to shear them off, which often takes a specialist, then you could be filling the air with this crystal dust that will slowly turn you into a crystal person. It'll start infesting your body and turning you into a kind of living crystal until eventually you are just a solid crystal and you're dead. There's a whole section here on faction play, how all the NPCs and factions relate to one another, how they feel about each other, and how you can manipulate them. We have an appendix just on some of the wondrous items that you can find, many of which are just very weird, and I love that. It gets players very excited when they get a strange magic item that they slowly get to understand and figure out over time. There is the red tome, which is hundreds of loose plates pressed from rose gold and collected into a palm-sized folio. The cover is a rock crystal lens that magnifies the writing within. It's a very cool wizard spell book. And this has level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 level spells. A lot of these are kind of new spins on classic BX spells, but given this flavor of these Empyreans that live in these crystal ships between the stars. Appendix D is Scarlet Town and the Environs. So this is the local town that you're going to use as a base of operations, both for this adventure and possibly for other tombs in the nearby area. It is a standard frontier, lawless Western town, and any law that is enforced is mostly just to the benefit of whoever happens to be enforcing it that day. There's a whole bunch of different factions at work here, including things like the Gem Consortium, the Jolly Diamond, or the Green Hills Investing Syndicate. Each of them has a certain number of thugs and some really vibrant, fleshed out NPCs that you can play. Some of them have really great names like Big Tunny and the Deadheart Boys, who only has 8 thugs, but they all have desires, they have fears, and so you know how to run them. You can get a very sense of what their psychology is. We even have some philanthropist organizations like the Allotrope Tabernacle and the League of Saloon Keepers and Madams for the Common Defense. There's 2d10 different Scarlet Town intrigues that you can draw from here if you want rumors or weird stuff going on. There's an absolutely delightful map here of the frontier itself, with all sorts of great names like the Barrow Fields, the Emperor's Ribbon, which is like this long sort of aqueduct-like road, I suppose. The Bay of Fallen Stars, the mountain range is called the Maiden Tombs. Very evocative. You could build all sorts of fun things on top of that. There's a really short one-page gazetteer here, the Frontier Mapped, and it's all written in-world if you want to get a good sense of how Gus L. intended this world to be understood, but of course you can take it or leave it, but I thought it was a fun read. As I mentioned before, there is a bonus adventure in here, Common Grave, that you can also explore. It's a smaller little tomb. It's mostly done in this kind of spiral style where you enter right here and you slowly go up this spiral staircase up to level 2 and you keep going up and you keep finding these little alcoves on the sides full of crypts that you can crack open and try and loot the treasure. But of course there's weird monsters and weird items in there as well. Now this doesn't have the same level of depth in terms of weird traps and factions and things like that, but it is still a good little bonus adventure that you can drop in there if you wanted to continue in the Crystal Frontier and the players just want more treasure and want to try another dungeon. Even the simple treasures that you can pull out of these crypts are often just really fun and evocatively described, like a square-cut onyx pendant set in copper, or a moldered tome of strange theology in silver set in brass case, or a tiny golden bee charm. Stuff like that. It makes things very concrete, and players are more likely to write it down on their character sheet and remember it if it's something really evocative like that. They can imagine their characters wearing it. Once players climb the initial spiral, they come up here, they can go through this kind of hanging garden in the middle, and they continue their exploration that way. There's a little offshoot going that way as well. Now, this seems like a fairly linear dungeon, but there is some alternate ways you can go through this, including very near the beginning, you can climb a tower on the outside of this giant crystal and climb down into here, so you can actually start near the top if you look around at your surroundings and try and find another way in. At the very back, we get some player handouts, some black and white versions of some of the things that players might need to see. And we have an expedition tracking sheet, which is really cool, especially for a very dungeon-focused game. You got your marching order, keep track of the treasure that's recovered, a turn tracker right here where you can tick things off every 10 minutes. Every time you get to a triangle, then a torch burns out, and when you get to a hexagon, then a lantern burns out. We even have faction reputations here as well, where you can see the starting relationships between the different factions, and those can slowly drift in one direction or another, depending on how the players interact with it. So that's Tomb Robbers of the Crystal Frontier. It's really a great starting dungeon. It has lots of interactivity. It has a great way of teaching new players about all the different types of things they might find in a dungeon, and it encourages creative thinking over direct combat. It's definitely going on my list of adventures to run as soon as I get the chance. Now, before we go today, got to do a shout out to all of the patrons who supported Questing Beast over the last month. And those patrons are Grant G, Tycho, Zachary Fullerton, Francisco Morales, Val Siddell, Jonathan Seastead, Jose Trujillo, Gregory Phillips, Ben Gorman, Lee Stanford, Maxim Lowe, Zach, Maximilian Dunholter, Liam Sterner R, Jiggy Van Dam, Andrew Schroker, Pele Nilsson, Con Kafka, Ego Orb, Micah Davis, Rob Alexander, Aaron Young Johan, and Fabrizio Brunetti. Thanks again for supporting the channel, everyone, and I'll see you next time.